it's always that one person I'm talking to. Even though I know there are thousands of people listening, if I start thinking on that grand scale, then it kind of loses that edge for me that, yes, I'm helping a lot of people, but I don't get the satisfaction as much as realizing that it's that one person. If I can help that one person, then I feel so much better than knowing that I'm helping thousands of people out there.
Thank you for taking the time to listen into the Why Influence podcast, where we interview influencers about their why and motivation for sharing online. I'm your host, Jeremy Siegel, and today our guest is Mark Cotes. Mark has 5 podcasts with a combined total of 475 episodes. He has so many moving pieces, I don't know where to begin, so let's just jump into the interview.
Welcome to the Why Influence podcast, where we deep dive into the why behind some of the world's most influential people. Why do you influence? Why are you an influencer? We hope to inspire you to share your voice with the world. And now, your host, Jeremy Siegel.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've been checking out your podcasts, and you've got some really great content, really high caliber media you've put together. For our audience, can you just really briefly summarize or give us the elevator pitch in like 2 or 3 sentences, what your platforms and your podcasts are all about?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show, Jeremy. My platform, I host the Resourceful Designer podcast. My history is I've been 30 years as a graphic designer, web designer. So I've been 30 years in the industry, 15 years or almost 15 years running my own design business. And in 2015, I decided to start a podcast that was talking directly to people in the same situation as I was, wanting either running or wanting to run a design business. And that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years. In fact, today celebrates the 4th anniversary. The day we're recording this is the 4th anniversary of Resourceful Designer.
Wow. Well, congrats. 4 years. That's a long time.
Thank you.
So when you first started podcasting, it's my understanding that the Resourceful Designer wasn't your first podcast. Is that true?
That is true. I actually got into podcasting in 2013. Okay, let me give you a little bit of a backstory. In 2012, I discovered podcasts. I didn't know what podcasts were before that till I updated my iPhone and I saw that little purple app that said podcast, and I had no idea what it was. And when I clicked on it, I started looking through, again, not knowing what they were, and I found the television section. And the very first podcast at the top was a television show that I just started watching the night before. So I clicked on it to see what this whole podcast thing was, and I started listening to these 2 guys talking about this television show. The show was called Revolution, by the way. So I was listening to them, and I thought, okay, this is kind of cool. These 2 guys are talking about this television show. This is neat. But then one of the guys said something on the podcast, and I know he said it in jest, but the way he said it, I was like, no, that's not right. That's not at all what happened in the television show. And at the end of the episode, they encouraged people to send in feedback. So thinking of that, I decided to send in feedback to the show saying, like, you were wrong. This is what happened in the television show, not what you said. And the next week when I tuned in just to find out what happened, they read my email on the air. And I got a big buzz. I got a big boost of adrenaline and ran to my wife and said, hey, they read my email on their show. And that kind of got me hooked on podcasts. So I started becoming a regular contributor. After that, I started sending in voice messages as my feedback. And I started subscribing to a lot of different television show podcasts and contributing to some of them, not to all of them, and going through. And then a year later in 2013, there was a television show I was watching called Orphan Black. And I was watching the show, and the pilot had just aired, and I said, I got to find a podcast for this show. It's so good. And I couldn't find a podcast. So week 2, I watched the second episode. There was no podcast. After week 3, there was finally, after the 4th week of watching the show and still no podcast, I said, well, if nobody's going to do one, I might as well do one myself. So I reached out to the guy from that very first podcast, and I says, hey, I've been sending in some feedback to you guys. I want to start a podcast. Can you help me out? So in 2013, I launched my very first television show podcast, and I made my network, Solo Talk Media, which is still going on today. So that's how I got into podcasting, was doing television show fan podcasts. In fact, today I just wrapped up on the television show Killjoys. I just wrapped up the very final episode of the podcast. The television show's over. So when the television show finishes, my podcast finishes. So I retired that one today. And then after a couple of years, getting into podcasting got me into social media. I wasn't in social media before. And when I started podcasting, people told me that you really should be on Facebook and that sort of stuff. So reluctantly, I got into Facebook. And through that, I discovered groups, and I discovered that there was graphic design groups. So I got in there and I started communicating with other designers. And a lot of newer people were asking questions, and I was going in answering questions, and I felt good about myself because I knew the answers. I'd been doing this long enough. And after a while, I realized that I'm answering the same questions over and over again in multiple groups, or sometimes in the same group, just by different people. And I says, why am I spending this one-on-one? Not that that's not valuable time, spending one-on-one with people. But I said, I can do this on a larger scale. I already know how to podcast. Why don't I start a podcast for graphic designers? And that's how the whole idea of Resourceful Designer was born.
Yeah, that's a awesome story. So you really eased your way into this industry. You started out by discovering podcasts, listening into ones that you were interested in, contributing to those, hearing yourself on it, getting that thrill from hearing your voice on the other end, and then finding a hole in the marketplace where you wanted something that didn't exist. So then you decided to create the podcast for that. And then you felt almost like obligated to do that. And then that's sort of your entry into podcasting.
Yeah, correct. There were other design podcasts, just like if you look at any podcast, there's probably a podcast for any subject you think of. So there were some other design podcasts out there, some good ones at the time. But they were all talking about the design industry, and most of them were multiple hosts discussing stuff amongst each other. Now, when I podcast, I don't have a co-host. I podcast by myself. I tend not to interview people. So it's just me one-on-one talking to my listener. And I decided that there was a podcast needed of somebody who is running a home-based graphic design business. You can call it a freelance business. I don't like using that term, but some people, that's what I am to them. And I knew that there was other people wanting to do the same thing. So I decided that I would use my experience to share with those who were coming up or just starting in that.
So with your Resourceful Designer podcast, you've got 184 episodes now. You've been doing it for right about 4 years. Have you had people reach out to you and tell you that you've had an impact on them, or some of the information you gave them had a certain impact on them? Have you gotten feedback from your listeners?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I get it all the time. And let me tell you, Jeremy, it's both humbling, but it's also scary, because the type of feedback I get from people is, Mark, I've been listening to you for so long. I finally built up the courage after hearing your message, and I quit my job to start my own business. And that is a scary thing, because now I'm thinking, wow, I just encourage somebody, not directly saying go quit your job, but because of hearing my success and me explaining how to go about do things, they built up the courage to quit a job. And just getting a message like that, I don't know what type of job. Was that person in a cushy job? Was it a good job? Did they have benefits? And did they just lose all that stuff because of me? But on the flip side, I know the benefits. Like, I would never go back to working. I spent 15 years as a designer working for a company, and I know I would never go back to that. So I feel very happy for them doing that. But again, it's kind of every time I get one of those messages or one of those emails, it's a mixed bag of emotions. It's like, oh, I hope it works out for them. And I hope that 6 months, a year, 5 years down the road, they don't come back at me and say, Mark, it's because of you I quit my job, and now look at it. So yeah, I definitely influence people in that way. I get those messages all the time. Another story I can share with you, Jeremy, is about a year into the podcast, I got an email from somebody in Brazil who is a professor at a design school. And he wanted to thank me for the content I was putting out, and told me that he had actually made my podcast required listening for his students.
Wow.
And to me, that was something that's unexpected. I never thought that would happen. I don't know if it's still going on or not. I'd never heard back. I tried to stay in touch a little bit at the beginning, but I never heard back from him. But just knowing that the content I was putting out was good enough that a professor teaching design would use it in his class and make it required listening for his students, that was the type of feedback I was getting to let me know that, yes, what I was doing had an impact.
Very cool. So I get the impression that you got your podcasts based on the TV shows, and those have a lifespan because the TV show only has so many episodes. And then you've got your Resourceful Designer podcast, which is more of a long-term personal passion podcast. So I guess going into starting the Resourceful Designer podcast, what was going through your mind? Like, what prompted you to start it or feel obligated to start it or feel so passionate that you felt you had to put your voice out there for that podcast?
I won't lie. One of the things was the adrenaline I feel when podcasting. Whenever I would podcast about the television show and I would interact with people, I love that feeling. And I love being a designer. I've been a designer for so long. It's my life. I spend my day designing. I've decided to bring that into the whole design space. And it was that love, that passion of that. And I'll admit the adrenaline of getting behind the microphone and talking and sharing with people. That's what really made me want to start a design podcast. But with that said, I actually was ready or planning to launch the podcast in 2014. I had recorded my intro episode. I'd actually done an interview. At the time, I didn't know if it was going to be an interview-based show or not. 184 episodes in, I think I've done 5 interviews and all of those. But I'd actually recorded an interview with somebody, and then I held on to it for a full year before I finally launched the show on September 30th of 2015. And the whole reason behind that is, even though, yes, I had been a designer for, at that time, just over 25 years, I still thought that it was the whole imposter syndrome that came up. And I was thinking, like, nobody knows who I am. I'm not a name in the design space. I've never designed something for some big, major, famous company. I was running a successful design business. It was enough to sustain me and make a good income. But why would somebody want to listen to me? And that held me off launching for a full year, actually just over a year, that I kept holding off because I kept having that feeling. Why was anybody going to want to listen to me? Who am I? I'm a nobody. And it wasn't until some of my other podcasting friends finally told me, says, Mark, you got to snap out of this. You've got a message to share. Start launching. And I'm glad they did finally kick me in the butt there and get me to launch, because I've had no regrets since, other than the fact that I waited that full year. I wish I would have launched when I originally thought to.
Okay. So you had this feeling of imposter syndrome that sort of set you back a little over a year for launching your podcast. And then you had your friends who were supportive, telling you that your voice matters and you need to get out there. But what kind of, like, I guess, baby steps or small steps did you take to work through that whole imposter syndrome to build up the confidence?
It was just a matter of figuring out ideas, figuring out content. During that year, I reworked how the podcast was going to be. Originally, at the time that I was starting this podcast, I was turning 45 years old. And I had this idea going through my mind that as I get older, are people still going to want to hire a designer that's 45, 50, 55, 60? Are people going to want to hire an old designer like that? So originally, I started thinking that maybe I was going to start a podcast to help other people that were the same age as I was in the design industry, just to kind of remind them that, yes, okay, we do still have something to offer to people that require design services, even though we're getting older. And there's a younger generation that has all sorts of stuff that maybe we don't understand or we didn't grow up with, but we still have something to offer them. And that was initially my thought. But the more I was doubting myself a little bit, like, who's going to want to hire me? And yet here I was thinking that I was going to talk to other people and tell them that they're worth hiring. And so I had to get out of that mindset and realize that even though I was getting up there in age, I still mattered in the industry. And it wasn't until I got over that hurdle of realizing that age really didn't matter. It was the experience, the skills, the knowledge. That's what really mattered. Once I realized that, then it kind of opened up and I realized, okay, I don't need to just talk to people my age. I need to talk to designers in general. And I decided to focus on people that were running their own design business, either as a freelance, as a side gig, or running a home-based business like I was. So that's kind of the hurdle I faced at the beginning.
Okay. And your original plan for the podcast before you reworked it, did that focus on the home-based designers then, or was that part of the rework that came as a result?
No, that was part of the rework. Originally, I was just anybody that was in the design industry, whether you were running your own business, whether you were freelancing, whether you were working at an agency, you were in a design department at some company. It didn't matter where you were working. It was more just your age. And I think not realizing at the time That's what was holding me back, was I was thinking of the age limit. And it wasn't till I realized, and again, that was just a time in my life when I'd hit my mid 40s and I kind of went, wait a minute. I'm not as young and spry as I used to be here. Not that I was considering myself old, but it was just at a time like that. Then once I realized that age really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're 20 years old, 30 years old, 40, 50, 60. If you're a good designer, you're a good designer. Age has nothing to do with it. So once I eliminated that, then all of a sudden the doubts that were holding me from starting the podcast or releasing the podcast were gone. And then I started focusing on, okay, well, what do I really know? What message do I want to share? And that's when I decided that I'd been running my own design business for, well, at the time, it was almost 10 years. I said, that's what I can share. I've been doing this successfully, and there's a lot of designers out there that really want to do this. They want to start their own business, even if it's just as a side gig. They might have a full-time job somewhere else, but they might want to do a few things on the side. Well, I can help them with that sort of thing. I wasn't going to talk to them about graphic design because it's an audio podcast, so there's no sense talking about design itself. I was talking about running a design business, how to deal with clients, how to deal with the bookkeeping, how to do with just the fact if you're a home-based designer means you're usually isolated. You're working by yourself every day, how to get through the day, knowing that you don't have coworkers to talk with and dealing with that isolation and how to find help when you need help and all that stuff. So once I realized that there was so much I can talk about, it's like a weight was lifted, and I knew exactly at that time what Resourceful Designer would be. And now 4 years into the journey, I still have so much to talk about, and it's going strong, and I'm helping people, and I'm grateful for that one epiphany I had 4 years ago that made that transition from talking to old designers to talking to home-based or freelance designers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and all of that does seem to line up. You found this shift of focusing on people's age, which is sort of a demographic, to more of their like situation, and then you had people telling you that your voice matters. So you discovered that your voice matters, and you found a way to help people in the community that you felt like you could help. And the combination of those two just sort of gives you the momentum to start going. I can relate to that because that's how I felt with my podcast. Like I struggled with sharing, didn't share a lot, and then I questioned that. So that's why I started the podcast, to help others discover that, because it's something I struggled with. So moving on, I'd like to revisit, you talked about how you love the adrenaline of podcasting and you love design. So a combination of, we talked about what it took for you to get started, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about what's keeping you going, what's making you unstoppable. Why are you making it 4 years and not feeling like you're going to be ending anytime soon, that it's just something that's a long-term vision for you? So you talked about the adrenaline that comes from podcasting. Do you still get a lot of adrenaline when you're creating episodes today, 4 years in?
I do. I won't say it's all that way. There's still difficulties. I mean, I release an episode every Monday morning, and an episode comes out, which means that every week I have to come up with a new topic. And sometimes I have an ongoing list of topics that I will potentially cover in the future, but sometimes you'll look at them and go, really, there's nothing on this list that I feel like talking about. And there's been days where, like, I normally record on Wednesdays, and there's been days Wednesday morning where I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, but there's always something that'll trigger something. I'll get up in the morning and I'll read through my emails. I'll look at a few different articles for different sites I'm subscribed to. And sometimes it'll be one word or one sentence, or maybe I'll listen to a podcast that has nothing to do with design, and somebody will say one comment, and that one comment all of a sudden will just spark in my head, and I'll come up with an entire podcast episode that my podcast episodes range anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, depending on what I have to talk about. And that sometimes that one little comment or one little thing I read or something will all of a sudden that spark. And then that's when the adrenaline hits and I realize, okay, this is what the episode's going to be about. So those are the times I really like. Now, sometimes that happens the day that I'm going to record, and sometimes that'll happen weeks in advance. There's times where I know exactly what episode is going to be the next episode, but all of a sudden something will happen and I'll get that spark, and it's that adrenaline. And I know that, no, whatever I had scheduled for the next, scheduled to record, that one can wait because this one's going to take precedence because of the feeling I have for it. So that love and that passion, it's always there. The other thing that keeps me going, as I said earlier, is that just the correspondence that I get from the people that listen. I've got a Facebook group, and the people in there are always tagging me and asking me stuff or thanking me for things. Every time a new episode comes out, they comment on it. I mean, I like all that stuff, but it's more the one-on-one that I really enjoy. It's knowing that I'm helping at least one person out there, one audience member, one person that's listening to my podcast. If whatever I say this episode, if it gets through to them, that one person, then I did my job. I don't expect the thousands of people that listen. I don't expect to help every single person with every single episode. But as long as one person gets help, then I feel satisfied with what I've done.
So speaking on the helping your community and helping the one person who's out there, why is it important to you to help these people, to help the person that you're speaking to help your listeners and the people in your community? Like, to you, why is it so important?
I don't know. There's just something satisfying about it. I'm not in this for money. I'm not in this to monetize my podcast. I started this podcast because I wanted to help people. And it's that one person out there that I can help. Now, when I say that one person, there could be hundreds or thousands of people that I'm helping. But in my mind, whenever I'm podcasting, I'm not podcasting. I look at my download numbers. I know how many people are listening to the show. But when I'm podcasting, I'm talking to one person. And there's other podcasters that have an avatar. They know exactly who that one person is. They give that person a name. They give that person a backstory and age and all that. I don't do that, but I still, when I'm podcasting, I'm talking to one individual person. So that's the person I'm trying to help. And I might not know their situation, but I'm still talking to them because I figure if they're listening to me, then A, they're a designer. B, they either have a design business or want to start a design business. And C, they want to learn. And that's what I'm there for, is to teach them, to share my experience, because that's what it is. I'm not talking about stuff I don't know. Everything I talk about, I have experience in. It could be experience that I succeeded, or it could be experience that I failed at something. But everything I share on my podcast, I have personal experience with it. And I'm sharing that knowledge with these people, hoping that they get something out of it, whether they follow my advice because it worked for me and it works for them, or they follow my advice and not do something I did because it didn't work for me and it possibly won't work for them. But it's always that one person I'm talking to, even though I know there are thousands of people listening. If I start thinking on that grand scale, then it kind of loses that edge for me that, yes, I'm helping a lot of people, but I don't get the satisfaction as much as realizing that it's that one person. If I can help that one person, then I feel so much better than knowing that I'm helping thousands of people out there.
I like that. I like that distinction, because a lot of people, when they sort of talk to a group, it can disconnect you a bit. But when you know for a fact that you're helping one person, you get that real story, then that's something that can give you a lot of momentum and drive to continue moving forward.
Yeah. And that's a lot of the feedback that I get is when people send me an email, they'll say, Mark, you're talking to me. And on my show, it's always you. I never talk about, oh, all of you listening right now. No, it's you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for pressing play. Thank you for tuning in, or that. And throughout the episode, I'll talk like, do you know this? Or have you ever done this? Or are you aware? That sort of thing. I'm always talking to you and never as a group. And the feedback I get emails every week from people thanking me or asking me something or wanting a follow-up on an episode I did and wanting some answers to a question that they have that maybe I didn't answer on the podcast, or some unique situation and they need some advice and that. And so many of them say that they love the podcast because they feel like I'm talking directly to them, which is exactly what I am trying to do. I am talking directly to each individual person listening. I'm not talking to them as a group.
Yeah, and I've actually gotten that feedback myself, and I'm trying to get better. I actually made a note card that I can put next to my screen. It has a picture that I drew of one person, and it says you next to it. And that's the person I can look over and as the audience to try to help train me to speak to the listener.
Mm-hmm. It makes a huge difference.
So thinking back to who you were before starting your podcasts and who you are today, how would you say that this whole journey has changed you, or this experience or the podcasting has changed you?
In a number of ways. I know I'm more confident, not just speaking, because I am a better speaker now than I was before, but I'm more confident in my abilities. I'm more confident in the messages I share. So when I share something, whether it's on the podcast or I'm talking to somebody in person, I'm more confident in the way I deliver it. There's no hesitation whenever I'm talking about something. The other thing it's done is it's made me look at my everyday life. As I'm designing something, as I'm reading something, as I'm listening to something, I'm always in the back of my mind thinking, is this something I could share? Is this a learning opportunity? Is this something that that person that I'm talking to can benefit from? And that could be, again, reading an article on something, and maybe one little paragraph from that article, I can take that and grow it into a full podcast episode. Or it could be as I'm working with a client, talking to a client, and then a situation arises where I'm discussing something with a client and they ask a question and because they don't know something and I have to answer the question. In the back of my mind now, which I never used to do before, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, is this something that I should be taking note of to share with somebody else? Because another designer could learn from this situation. So it makes me more aware of everything that I'm doing. So that's one way I find that this whole journey has really changed me, is I'm keying into those little things that before I would have just let pass by.
That's really interesting. I actually had a similar feeling happen recently related to that, which is I'm planning my honeymoon and I'm going to Botswana. It's just north of South Africa. And I was having trouble finding people to talk to about it. So I was constantly thinking of ways, asking friends, couldn't find anybody who lived in Botswana or had experience. And then I had the idea that I would go on Upwork, filter by Botswana, find people that have made at least $1. And there was like 7 people. So I created a job, invited those 7 people, had 2 or 3 that applied. So then I had a conversation with them, and now 1 or 2 of them is helping me with planning my honeymoon. It's just a creative, out of the box thing. I never really thought it was anything different or worth sharing. But then I shared that with a friend. He's like, oh, wow, like that's a really unique way of thinking.
That's amazing. You should see the smile on my face right now. That's just amazing, Jeremy.
That's awesome. Yeah, but that's really unique. And for me, like I never thought about sharing that much because I just didn't. I didn't post on Facebook, didn't share it online. And I'm seeing more of exactly what you just said, which is now I'm having situations happen. It's like, oh, wow, is that worth sharing? Is that something that people need to hear? And it's interesting.
Yeah, well, I know the stories make the podcasts. If it wasn't for a lot of the stories, and a lot of people probably wouldn't stick around with the podcast, but whenever I pick a topic, as I said earlier, I always try to make sure it's relevant or that I'm knowledgeable in that I have some sort of experience. So I'm not talking about something that I don't know anything about. The few times I mentioned earlier that I've had maybe 5 guests on the podcast, well, those 5 guests were because I specifically wanted to cover a topic that I don't know anything about. So I had the guests on there so that I can question them and share that information with my audience. But I only do that in those situations. Every other topic I pick, I have some sort of knowledge of, and I share that with the audience through my stories. So I will talk about recent things or going back. I've been in this industry for 30 years. I'll talk about when I very first started, the first time I dealt with a client, the first time a client rejected a design that I thought was an amazing design, and how I dealt with that. So a lot of those stories are what makes people relate to you. And it can be little insignificant things. Like I'll mention as I'm doing something, I might just in passing mention my daughter or my son or my wife or my dog or my cat or whatever. And it's little insignificant things like that. But that's the type of thing that creates a relationship between you and your listener. So the person at the other end might think it's like, oh, Mark has a dog. Well, I'm a dog person too. Oh, that's cool. You know, we've got that in common. Well, it has nothing to do with design. It has nothing to do with running a business, but it's a connection that that person has. And now that person is that little minuscule bit more invested in what I have to say because of that connection. That's one of the reasons why, if you're familiar with Pat Flynn and his Smart Passive Income podcast, yeah. At the beginning of his podcast, he has his voiceover guy give a unique detail about Pat every single episode. Well, I stole that idea from Pat. I actually talked to Pat and I mentioned to him that I took that idea and he loved it. He actually said we should compare notes. But for 184 episodes, I've had my voiceover guy share a unique little quirk about me. And it's different for every single episode. And I recently had a poll in my Facebook group, and I just, out of curiosity, I said, is there anything about the podcast that you'd like me to change? Anything that, if I had to get rid of a section of the podcast, which section would you want me to get rid of? And the main answer I got back was, I don't want you to change anything. But most people said, if you had to, and only if you absolutely have to, get rid of those intros. But I absolutely love them because it lets me know so much about you. So even little things like that have nothing to do with the topic you're talking about creates that relationship with people. And when that relationship is there, even though it's one-sided, I have no idea who these people are that are listening, but they now trust me that much more. And when I'm sharing something with them, they'll pay that much more attention because of those little details that creates that relationship and that commonality between them and me.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Actually, I have heard of how Pat Flynn has that intro and how big of an impact that's made. And I've talked to several people who don't even necessarily have that intro, but have created so much content that they don't even remember what they shared. And then some of their audience would approach them and bring up something from their past, like a deep past. And they'd be like, I have no idea. I don't even remember that myself. They share it in the moment. And then their audience ends up knowing more about them than he can recall himself on the moment.
Yeah, that happens to me all the time. I'll get somebody that, you remember when you said this? And I'm thinking, I said that? I don't remember saying that, but it's a good thing I keep good show notes, Jeremy, because there's been a few times where I've gotten an email and somebody will say, you said this on a podcast, and I'll go back through my show notes because they're usually pretty even with what I said on the podcast. They're not transcripts or all that. I rewrite the show notes, but it's usually follows what I said on the podcast. So I'll do a search through my own website to see. It's like, oh yeah, I did say that way back. Like, this was 3 years ago. I said that on this episode. So yeah, it happens all the time.
Wow. All right. So the way I see it, you've got these podcasts for the TV shows, and then you've got your main podcast for the Resourceful Designer. So how do you look at the TV show podcasts? Are those sort of stepping stone to you building up to doing the Resourceful Designer, and then it's more of like a hobby passion project? Or what are those other podcasts in relation to your Resourceful Designer?
They're completely different. The TV show ones are a hobby. They are just fun. When I used to work at another company, I used to work at a print shop, and I'd watch a TV show and I'd go in the next day and I'd talk to all these people about the TV show. Did you watch this? And whoever the person who had watched it, then just discuss, oh, what do you think of this? And the water cooler moment that you would have discussing last night's TV show. Well, working at home, I didn't have that anymore. So that became my water cooler. I talk to people. My show is very feedback oriented. So I get a lot of people that send in their thoughts and then I comment on what they say. So a lot of my podcast is actually my listeners having a voice, and they say the same thing. I don't have anybody to talk about this television show with. So that's why I listen to your podcast, and then we talk about the show together over the podcast. So that's just a hobby of mine. The Resourceful Designer, even though I don't tie it to my business, I didn't create it as a funnel. I didn't create it for monetary purposes. I created it because I wanted to share. It's more business. Like when I'm thinking about the two of them, the Solo Talk Media, which is my television show podcast, that's all hobby. And if anything had to give, those would be the one that give. Resourceful Designer is part of my design business, even though it's not a funnel or not bringing, I'm talking to other designers. So I'm not getting any business out of this because the whole point is for them to build up their business in order to get clients. So none of them are coming to me for work, but I never expected that to begin with. So it was just to help, but it is a part of my business. It's a loss leader. I monetize it through affiliate sales, but in all honesty, I would make more money not doing the podcast and spending the time that I devote to the podcast. If I spent that time to designing, I would be making a lot more money than I am with whatever little bit of affiliate income I get through the podcast. But I never started it to make money. The money was just a happy side effect to recommending certain things on the show. And I could grow it more. I've had the opportunity to make more money, but just like I said that I would not share a topic that I didn't have experience with, I also don't advertise or promote anything that I don't have experience with. I've had sponsors offer me a substantial amount of money to be a sponsor on my show. But the issue is I wasn't familiar with the sponsor, or I didn't use, like there's a popular invoicing software. I won't name them, but they approached me and they offered me a hefty amount of money to sponsor my show. They're not who I use for invoicing. So to me, I turn them down because they're not the company that I use. So why would I promote them on my show? It would degrade the integrity of my show. I'm trying to share stuff with my audience that I believe in, that I know, that I have the knowledge of, that I have experience with. And I would not want to share something that, because I've told them many times what I use for invoicing, and it would seem strange to all of a sudden be sponsored by this company that I'm not using.
Right.
So I never built the podcast to make money. I built it to help people.
All right. So this is just something that came to mind, but I'm curious, do you get more fulfillment from your podcast or from the work that you do in designing? Or how would you distinguish?
It's two different things. I love designing. I love the outcome of creating something and seeing it put to use. And I love that part of it. The podcast, helping people, I love it just as much, but they're two different things.
Okay. Sort of like apples and oranges, then, not really able to directly compare.
Yeah, they're both helping people, because whenever I have a design client, I'm helping them with a solution to whatever problem they're having. And when I'm talking on the podcast, I'm helping those people with a possible solution to a problem they may be having. So in that sense, it's the same, but fulfillment or satisfaction, I keep them both separate, and I enjoy them each. At this point, after 4 years, I wouldn't want to give up either one of them.
Right. But yeah, they sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah. Even though, as I said, that they don't, like, one doesn't lead into the other. My design clients, I don't really share with them that I do a podcast, because the podcast's not for them. It's for other designers. And the designers, I'm not expecting to get any work from them, because that's the whole point of this, is to help them build up their business so they're getting their own work. They're not coming to me for work.
Right. All right. So earlier you talked about your Facebook community. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I guess maybe how you drove traffic to it, what the community feels like to you, how you interact with them, just a little bit about your Facebook community.
Sure. The Facebook group was originally, it was probably a year into the podcast where people in the podcast industry were talking about communities. And I decided, okay, I'm going to give this a try. I'll create a Facebook group. And the only place I ever mention the Facebook group is on the podcast. Even to this day, I don't mention it anywhere. Even in my show notes, there is nowhere on my website that talks about the Facebook group. The only place I ever mention it is in the podcast itself. So for the first couple of years, the only people joining were podcast listeners. And that was the whole point of it, was for people to get in there, discuss running a design business, asking for help, some of them asking for critiques on work and that. And it was going really well. Well, inevitably what happens is Facebook got wind that a lot of people were joining this group. So then they started promoting it to other people that might be interested, other people that had similar interests. They may have belonged to other design groups. So Facebook said, hey, well, if you like this group, you may like this one. Because all of a sudden, I started getting an influx of people in the group that didn't know there was a podcast, because I asked questions. One of the things, I do not let anybody into my group if you don't answer my 3 questions. And I say that on the podcast all the time, and I say it in the group. Even if you invite somebody, like, you know, another designer that would be great for the group, and you invite them in, great, I encourage it. But make sure that designer answers my question, because otherwise I decline them. And I don't care how good you look. Like, if I look at your bio or who you are, and I think this is the perfect person to be in my group, if they don't answer the questions, I don't let them in.
Yeah, Mark Deal talked a lot about that when he was talking about Facebook groups.
Yeah, well, I know Mark as well. Yeah, so it's the same thing. And I found by doing that, I've created a very tight group. Now, I think we're just under 2,000 people in the group. And I could say I don't have a moderator other than myself. And I think it was 3 years that I've had the group, I've only had to kick maybe 3 people out for spamming the group. Most of it is just dedicated designers wanting to learn, wanting to grow, needing help with their business and that. So it started off with a lot of people just asking me things and me posting things and trying to get interaction. But then it soon grew to other designers as more people joined. Now when somebody asks a question in the group, oftentimes they get all the right answers before I even get a chance to chime in. So sometimes I don't even bother anymore, or I'll just go in and say, like, I agree with so-and-so. I like they gave the right answers. So I find that I'm not that I'm not participating in the group as much as I was before, but there's so much good content and communication and all that unless I'm right on top of it, and I'm not, I only go into the group maybe once a day, sometimes twice a day. A lot of the times my job's already been done by somebody in the group. So I try to every once in a while post something to try to get a conversation started and that. But for the most part, it's grown into a really good community with a lot of people helping each other and that. But with that said, I've also have another community, which is a paid community, which is similar. I do that on Slack. And that one's a paid community, and it's much, much smaller than the Facebook group, obviously. But that one there is where there's a lot of interaction. And that one there, it's become almost like a mastermind group of designers. Actually, there is a mastermind group as part of that community. But there is where designers are getting to know each other, some from all over the country, all over the world, and know each other to the point where we know what that person's capable of, what their business is. what jobs they're working on and that, so that if they ask a question, we can answer them so much better than in the Facebook group where you ask a question, you don't know which one of these 2,000 random people will answer you. In the community that I have, the answers and everything is much more precise, and it's geared specifically to your situation because we've gotten to know each other so well in that community.
So you started the Facebook group 1 year approximately into your podcast. So how long into your podcast did you create the Slack community?
The Slack community was just created this past January. I actually did it through Patreon. I had a few Patreon supporters, and I decided that anybody who supported at a certain level would just become a founding member of the community. Now, I don't do it through Patreon anymore. Now they have to go through the website and sign up if they want to be a member. And some people have done that since then, but it's a small group. We're under 20 people right now. I get a few that join every once in a while, but we're under 20 people. But that's where I spend most of my time communicating with these people and getting to know them. We get on regular video chats where every day we're communicating with each other in the group and following up with people. So if somebody says they have a presentation to make at a big client's, well, the next day you're guaranteed that one or two people in the group are saying, how'd the presentation go? Do you think you got it? And that sort of thing.
That's great.
So not only are we getting to know people, we're becoming friends. I mean, these are the type of people that they're all over the place, but I can't wait to go on a trip somewhere where I'm near one of them to actually meet them face to face, where I've done that many times. Whenever I travel anywhere, especially like you and I, we met at Podcast Movement. I had a listener meet up at Podcast Movement where I met with, there was only one that showed up. The other two had to cancel, but I had a listener from Florida that I sat down with. And I've done that every year when I go to a conference. I always try to get listeners together. And I've had as many as like 8 or down to 1 to 8 people meet me at a time. But this community that I've built on Slack, these are people that I've gotten to know them since January, and I consider them friends now, and I would love to go meet them in person, where I can't say that to everybody in the Facebook group because it's just, Facebook groups, I find it's more impersonal. Like a lot of the people, you might see the same person posting over and over again, but you really don't know anything about that person.
That makes sense. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So we talked a lot about why you started, why you continue, what's going on with everything. So what are you most excited about as far as the future? What kind of goals do you have in place? What kind of dreams do you look forward to? Like what's inspiring you most about the future, about your platforms?
I mean, this kind of sounds a little counterintuitive to what I said earlier of speaking one-on-one with my listener, but I would love to get more speaking engagements, actually speaking to crowds. But again, as I said, it sounds weird considering the way I was talking before, but I would love to go talk at schools, design schools. So these are the people that are not yet in the industry, but they are thinking, they don't know what their future holds. They don't know what sort of jobs they're going to get. And some of them may decide to open their own business. So I would love to go kind of give them a taste of what it's like. I would like to present to business owners and that sort of thing. I've done that before where I've talked to business owners and present what design is and that. But I really like to talk to other designers and especially the ones that are either just starting off in running their own business or to those who have been running or those who are thinking of maybe one day, whether it's as a side gig or full time. I would love to just go and meet them, to actually be able to put a face to some of the people that may or may not be listening to me, introduce them to who I am and grow the audience that way. So I've had a few people reach out to me with opportunity, but unfortunately I wasn't able to take them up. Bad timing or just where it was in the world, and I didn't have the funds because I would have had to pay to go there. So,
right.
But I'm sure something's going to come up. So that I'm kind of looking forward to that. I'm also taking my, if you want to call it expertise of 30 years of design and now my love of podcasting. And I did start another business where I'm doing design specifically for podcasters. So I started a business at podcastbranding.co where that's my goal there, is to help podcasters with their branding, with the visual side, not the audio branding, but all the visuals. So their website, their artwork, their social media, imagery and all that. So that's a passion. I'd really like to grow that side of it. I really want to, even after all this time, and I love all my other clients, but I really want to be known as the graphic designer in the podcast space. So that would be a goal, both short and long term, that I'd love to develop and become known as the go-to graphic designer for podcasters.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I could see all those doors opening up for you as you continue down the path that you're going.
Thank you.
So of the podcasts that I know about, I don't know if there's any that you've like started and maybe liquidated or anything, but the main podcast for the Resourceful Designer and then the 4 TV show podcasts that I'm aware of, You've got almost 500 episodes total. You've tackled the platform pretty powerfully. So I'm just curious, do you have plans for either ramping up more on the podcasting and like doubling down more, or do you have plans to explore other platforms a little bit more aggressively? What's your outlook on how you see yourself focusing your energy as far as the platforms go moving forward?
I don't have any plans for another podcast. In fact, the one television show podcast that I just wrapped up, I recorded the final episode of it today. In that episode, I mentioned that there's no television show on the horizon that I'm going to start podcasting about. I'm going to be very picky because, as you know, Jeremy, podcasting takes time. And I do this during my business hours. I don't do this on weekends or at evenings. That's family time. So even though the television show podcast is a hobby, I'm using what should be my business hours in order to do it. And that's taking away a lot. And especially if I want to grow this podcast branding company, there's a lot more I have to do there. So I mentioned that I'm not going to start any new television show podcasts in the foreseeable future unless there's a television show that comes out that just completely blows me away and I have to podcast about it. But so far, I haven't seen anything on the horizon that fits that bill. Resourceful Designer, I plan to keep it. If I keep it going for another 4+ years, I'll keep it going. I've got no anticipation of stopping it. But one thing I do want to try more is getting into a little bit of YouTube. I've been repurposing my podcast episodes on YouTube, but we know those don't work that well. But I do have some specific content, whether it's repurposing some of my earlier episodes and not take the whole episode, but just like maybe one point from, say, I had a 30-minute episode, and in that episode, there might be a 2-3 minute segment, re-record that as a video, not just take the podcast and put it up, but actually re-record some content, as well as develop some new content, but just, it'll be more short form. So 3, 4, 5-minute videos of certain things. Same type of topic, how to run a design business, but at least with the video, I can go in and be a little bit more visual. So if I'm talking about maybe a great plugin to use for WordPress, I can actually go in and show how to set up the plugin, how to use it, and how I use it, and why I benefit from it, and why I think you might benefit from it. So even though I talk about stuff on my podcast, I think that YouTube would be a better platform for that. But that's about the only thing I see in the foreseeable future. I'm trying to grow a little bit more on Instagram, but I'm not very good at being consistent on it. So I don't know how well I'm going to make out on that platform.
All right. Yeah, I like that. I think that YouTube would be a great platform for you. So if you met someone who wants to create a podcast and hasn't started yet, or someone who just started and is trying to look for ways to early podcasting to ramp up, what would be the biggest pieces of advice that you would give this person?
Just start. One of the biggest things, I met you at Podcast Movement. I've been going to podcast festivals or these conferences for years now. And one of the biggest things I see when it comes to podcasters is so many of them are trying to get ready to start. And when I'm talking to them, it sounds like they've been ready for a while. They're always waiting for that one special thing that'll give them permission to launch. And there's so often that they don't need that. I hear people say, well, I have to have 10 episodes recorded, 20 episodes, 30. I heard somebody at Podcast Movement wanted 100 episodes recorded before they launched their podcast. And I think that's ridiculous. If you have an idea, start. The thing is when you first start, nobody's listening to you. So it doesn't matter what you sound like. It doesn't matter if you goof up. You're going to get better. And when you're doing it, episode 10 is going to be so much better than episode 1. Episode 20 is going to be so much better than episode 10. You've mentioned in your thing that you're going to have, after 30 episodes, I believe it is, you're going to have your friend there get on and interview again to see what you've learned. Well, I guarantee you that after 30 episodes, you're going to learn so much that your episodes there and after episode 30 are going to be completely different than what 1 through 30 was, right, or were, because of what you learn. And that's one of the things that I see with so many people is they're afraid and they just need to get started. Because what happens if you record 20, 30 episodes and you realize after releasing, 4 of them, that your audience says, well, there's really something, you're not doing this right. Can you fix this? Or we would really like you to do this instead. Well, you've got 20 plus episodes that still have that problem in it. What are you going to do with them? So it's okay to start with a few. I launched with 3. And even that, I didn't need to. In hindsight, I could have launched with 1 because at the beginning, nobody's listening to you. Unless you already have a name for yourself and you already have a platform and you already have an audience that's going to come to your podcast. So when you launch on day 1, you're going to have thousands of downloads. Most podcasters don't have anybody but family that are going to listen at the beginning. So just put it out there and get better with each episode. That's probably the biggest advice I can give is just launch it, learn from it, and then move on and get better with each episode.
That's huge advice. I mean, we talk a lot about giving yourself permission on the podcast, and that couldn't be more true from what I've seen as well. So even for me, I got a chunk up and live, and before we had this conversation, you were like, well, I haven't seen an episode in the past couple of weeks, like what's going on? And I'm revisiting, I'm still getting content, I'm still here interviewing you, and I've got 4 other episodes that I've recorded and haven't published yet. I'm just sort of getting things more organized to ramp things up. But I had already started at this point, and I feel like that just lets me take a break and then step up my game. So I think that starting is definitely the biggest thing, because now I've got to figure out how do I streamline my processes more. And I'm focusing on different things now than if I was trying to get to having 30 episodes pre-recorded before launching, because now I've gone through all these iterations.
Yeah, because the thing is I can guarantee whoever, if you're starting a podcast, by the time you get to episode 10 or 20, you're going to hate episode 1, no matter how much time, how much effort, how much you procrastinated because it had to be absolutely perfect. Once you get to 10 or 20, you're going to go back and listen to that first one, and you're going to hate it regardless. I don't like my first episode. I had been podcasting for 2 years with the television show podcast, so I knew what podcasting was like. I knew how to do it. I still don't like my first episode of Resourceful Designer. I probably don't like my first dozen episodes until I got the groove for the show. And even now, I'll go back, I'm at 184 released today. I'll go back and listen to episode 100, and there'll be things about it that I'll say, oh, I could have done that so much better. But you just learn from that, and you keep going so that episode 185 is going to be better than episode 184. You just got to keep learning.
Yeah. And for me, just to share, on my episode 20, I actually completely changed the flow of the interview. So if you listen to episode 1 through 19, verse 20 and onward, I'd already completely shifted how the flow goes.
And that's the great thing about this medium is you can do that. But what you can't do is if you've already got 60 episodes done and you realize by episode 20 that you want to change the flow, what are you going to do?
Yeah. You got to decide if you want to trash all that content or just put it out in something that you're not happy with. All right. So that's advice for a new person. What if you met someone who's experienced in podcasting? You've got a lot of experience with it, and there's likely things that you're doing that you feel like is different than the average podcaster. So do you have any secret sauce or things that you would like to share with someone who's more experienced with podcasting, maybe a year or two into podcasting? Like what kind of advice you would give to that person?
Well, it's actually advice I shared earlier when we were talking, and that is to make sure that when you're talking to your audience, you're talking to one person. You're not talking to a crowd of people. It doesn't matter how many people download your show, whether you're getting 20 downloads, 100 downloads, 1,000 downloads, or 50,000 downloads. You're talking to one person because they are not all together listening to your show. Every single person out there is listening to the show using their own earbuds or headphones. They're in their own car listening to it. They're at home by themselves listening to it. Very rarely will a group of people listen to a podcast. And that's one of the things that I've seen experienced podcasters do is they are talking to a group. You can get so much more engagement. That relationship that I talked about earlier of getting them to appreciate you because they feel like they're connecting to you. In order to do that, you have to talk to that one individual. No matter what your download numbers say, you're always talking to one person. And that's one thing that established podcasters, a lot of them get it right, but there's so many of them that get it wrong, where they start talking about, hey, all of you out there, hey, everybody listening, this is not radio. This is podcasting. And podcasting is a one-on-one medium. So that's one of the big things I would tell an experienced podcaster, to make sure you're doing that. And you will see your engagement and your loyalty from your audience, from your listener, will be much stronger because of it.
That's great advice. Well, Mark, before I open the floor for you to pitch your stuff and we close out the episode, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience? Do you have any last words of wisdom or advice that you'd like to share, knowing the type of audience we have here?
The only thing is, I know it's corny. You've probably heard it lots of time before, but there's no such thing as perfect. Go for better and you'll make it. If you try to wait for perfection, you are shooting yourself in the foot to begin with. You're never going to get there and you're never going to be satisfied. But if you aim for good, then that you know that you can reach good and that there's always that little bit better that you can get. So ignore perfection and just aim for good and you'll be a success.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to end the podcast by giving you an opportunity to talk about your brand, your social accounts, your podcasts, your services, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience.
Sure. Television show pod can all be below talkmedia.com. I just wrapped up on the television show Killjoy. So the only live podcast I have left there is for the television show The Expanse, which I'm not aware was a show on Sci-Fi. It got canceled Sci-Fi and is on it up. So season 4 and season, if it's been renewed for 2 seasons, will be on Amazon Prime. So if you're a fan of The Expanse or you're planning on checking it out, because seasons 1 through 3 are now available on Amazon Prime, you can follow The Expanse podcast, Tales from the Rocinante. That's at solotalkmedia.com. My graphic design podcast is at resourcefuldesigner.com. Now, you listening right now may not be a designer, but if you know a designer, whether it's somebody that's running their own design business or somebody who may potentially want to run their own design business, let them know about resourcefuldesigner.com because I'm talking to them. And of course, if you want to start a podcast and need help with your website, with your artwork, with your social media branding and all that, check out podcastbranding.co.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your journey and being vulnerable with us. I hope you have a great remainder of 2019. And I look forward to seeing your influence keep on growing.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Jeremy.
Not a problem. Well, that concludes the interview. Thank you so much for listening to the episode in its entirety. Mark, thanks again for coming on the show, being vulnerable with us, and sharing your why. I just want to share a couple of my favorite takeaways from our conversation. My favorite nugget that Mark talked about, which he mentioned multiple times, is addressing the audience as you, as one single person, because you're not oftentimes listening to a podcast in a group. It's not like you're going to call all your friends together and sit in front of a TV and listen to a podcast or watch a podcast as a group. So it's always good to just talk to you because you're the only person on the other side of this. That's something that I've been told about multiple times, and I've been struggling to get that habit in. One thing that I've done is draw a picture of a head, put it next to my monitor, and then anytime I need to address you, I look at my monitor, look at the head, and then I know there's only one person that's sitting right there. So then it reminds me to talk to you and not say you guys or address a community or a group of people. I like how vulnerable Mark was with us, and he really shared a lot of his struggles through his journey. He talked about how he had imposter syndrome and delayed his initial launch of his podcast for a year because he needed to figure out a way that he was comfortable with putting himself out there. He needed to figure out that his voice really did matter. A lot of people were encouraging him to get started. You'd be surprised, but a lot of people struggle to get started. You're not alone in struggling to get started with whatever it is that you're trying to start. I'm really proud how open and vulnerable Mark was with us because that's how we got so much value from him because he was just so open with the struggles that he had, how he overcame them, and all of those things. Mark suggested that you just get started and just put something out there and then tweak it and then put something else out there and then tweak it and put something else out there. He suggests that method as opposed to what some people talk about, which is getting a backlog of 100 episodes and then starting to release those before you even have the first one out. The issue with that is how much you evolve over time. I mean, look at my podcast. The first couple, I self-improved myself. I changed questions to the first 20. And then at 20, I really pivoted how my podcast flow goes. And now I'm doing something completely different. A lot of people say, well, I've got 30 episodes in the pipeline, so I can release one a day for the first month. But for me, I've tweaked so much for the first 20 episodes that I can't imagine being locked in without being able to self-improve and constantly change things. And it's not just from self-improving and noticing what I need to improve, it's listening to you. I've gotten a lot of emails from listeners who liked things that I did or said, hey, you could do this better. And I really like getting those emails. I even had a professional podcaster formally audit my podcast, and I plan to do that again because I want to keep tweaking things and keep improving things, and I think that's important. So don't get too tied up with having a bunch of content right away. I think it's important to just get started and then tweak as you go. And then if you want to create a bunch of content, now that you got the system down and you feel comfortable with the flow, I think it makes a lot more sense to do it at that point. Now, before we started the interview, when I first started talking with Mark, he mentioned that he listened to 5 to 6 episodes of the podcast. I don't know any guest that I've interviewed that has listened to that many episodes, let alone listen to any episode of the podcast before coming on. I mean, maybe someone glanced at a couple, but Mark listened to 5 to 6 episodes, and that says a lot about his character and how much he cared, and it was really powerful to me that he did that. Not only was that preparation beneficial to our conversation, so he knows what to expect, but he was prepared for all the flaws that I was doing as a podcast interviewer. He told me a couple of things I was doing that could actually throw off a guest, and it helped me with my self-awareness. He came prepared to overcome those barriers because he listened to a couple episodes and he was prepared to have those situations come up. For example, I would start the podcast off by saying, thanks for coming on the show, and then jump into a question. I didn't give the space for the guest to say, oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on the show or something like that. I would just jump into a question. It sort of makes an awkward situation. And he pointed out that. I think there was one or two other more. I learned a lot from Mark. I appreciate him coming on so prepared, and I appreciate him coming on here and being so vulnerable. We got a ton of value both from Mark sharing with us and also giving feedback to the podcast. Now, I met Mark at Podcast Movement. It was a podcast conference, and we were standing in line together when we were checking into the registration and just started talking and having a conversation. Mark's a regular. He's been around the community for a long time, and he's a really nice guy. We just had a great conversation while we were staying there in line. And at the end of it, I was like, wow, this guy's really interesting. He's a really nice guy. I asked him if he would come on my podcast as a guest. And at first he was like, oh, well, what would you want me to talk about? And I told him about the podcast and how a deep dive into his why. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And then we scheduled a time, and here we are. After this interview, Mark and I chatted for a while, and I feel like he's a new friend of mine. And it's interesting how this podcast has opened doors for that. I wouldn't have, let alone be at a podcast conference if I didn't have the podcast, but then I wouldn't have any reason to follow up with him if I didn't have a podcast where I could interview him as a guest. On top of that, Mark suggested 6 to 7 people I reach out to that I can name drop him to try to bring on the podcast as a guest who are big in the podcasting community. And that's pretty awesome because right now the biggest struggle for me is to get more guests on the show. This relationship may help me get another handful of guests, and that's awesome. Mark, I just want to reiterate and thank you so much for coming on here and sharing with us. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot of value from a lot of things that you shared with us and our story of how we interacted and how now we have a relationship as a result of my podcast. Now, we all know what Mark is looking for. He's looking to help other podcasters build brands, both with websites and graphic designs. So if you have a podcast yourself, or if you're looking to start a podcast, I strongly suggest that you reach out to Mark directly. Tell him you heard him on the Why Influence podcast and see if he can help you out. Mark's also looking for more speaking engagements. So if you come across any opportunities where Mark might be a good fit as a speaker, then reach out to him. Tell him that you heard him on the Why Influence podcast and that you want to send a potential speaking gig his way. Now, if you're still listening, I want you to take a moment and just give yourself a pat on the back because this is a self-development related podcast, and just the fact that you made it this far means that you care about improving yourself and learning from others. So just give yourself a pat on the back for making it this far, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen in because there's a lot of other options out there, and you chose the Why Influence podcast to spend your time to listen to. Here on the Why Influence podcast, our mission is to inspire the sharing of hidden knowledge and wisdom so we can raise the collective consciousness level of the human race. Our guests, like Mark, share unintended consequences that they've received, along with stories and strategies of how they overcame self-made barriers to initially begin and to continue growing their influence. If there's anybody in your community or people that you interact with that you find struggle to share, then it would be awesome if you could share this podcast with them because the whole idea is that we want to help inspire others to start sharing their hidden knowledge and wisdom. If you'd like to join the Why Influence community where we support each other in overcoming self-made barriers and growing more influence, then I suggest you go to whydiscord.com, whydiscord.com, whydiscord.com. Can't believe I almost forgot, but if you want to learn more about Mark, see his podcast, go to his website and see his services, go to the whyinfluence.com and navigate to episode 23, and you'll find all the links to his websites, his podcasts, and everything there in the show notes. So just go to whyinfluence, whyinfluence.com, and navigate to episode 23, and that's Mark's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Why Influence podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.